Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Wilson. I'm a designer here at Google, and one of the creators of this series, Design Is. We made this monthly talk series to really make space for those working in design, creativity, technology, those working in that intersection to make space for really discussing topics that help craft a future that we all want to be a part of. So today's talk is a really exciting one. It's about curiosity, which makes me excited. It's really about not looking at problems that exist today, but thinking about putting curiosity at the center of your practice to think, expand your imagination, also think about new problem spaces. So our speaker, Lining Yao, is a material engineer, a designer, and an assistant professor at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon. She's an adjunct professor of mechanical engineering and material sciences and engineering. She leads a team at the Morphing Matter Lab, which sounds very cool, developing materials, tools, and applications of adaptive, dynamic, and intelligent morphing matter from nano to macro scales. Her work is increasingly relevant to the design field, particularly looking at the intersection of the physical and digital world coming together. So let's give it up for Lining Yao.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to Google. And my topic today is design is passionately curious. So great minds are curious. These are Leonardo da Vinci's sketches when he was trying to study the fluid dynamics. So in particular, this is the water flow or fluid flow in general. And later on, the Caltech professor tried to use computational approach to visualize the blood flow that was envisioned by him many years ago. And this is one of my favorite Bauhaus instructors and also one of the greatest painters in the history, Paul Klee. So he actually was immensely curious about how the plants grow. Based on how branches are formed, he designed his art piece, and also he tried to study the rooting mechanism and created imaginative paintings of rooting. And this was actually a work from one of my dear inspiring friends, Iran Sharon. So he's a physicist from the University of Hebrew. So when he does this demo, he likes to basically tear off a piece of paper. So it turns out if you tear off a piece of paper, or if you tear maybe even just a trash bag like shown on the screen, you will see all these wavy patterns formed on the edge. And he developed basically both the mathematical and also physical models for this wavy pattern formation. And eventually that explained basically how our plants and flowers and even corals grow along the edge. This is due to the cell differential growth. And with this discovery, he wrote some science papers. But in addition, this is actually one of the craziest things he did I really liked. So he put some chemicals selectively on different areas along the edge of the leaf. And after a couple of days, he started to see a wavy pattern formed. Basically, he's sculpting nature, if you think about it. It's not through a genetic modification, but it's through the idea of reconstructing nature through geometric parameters. So when I started to encounter these beautiful stories, either in my life or in other people's life, I always have those scenarios in my head. These people are curious. So Da Vinci, he used to run into the sand right after horses passed by on his street because he wanted to study sand. My dear friend Iran, he will staring at those leaves for months and months, try to be excited by the waves. Or Newton, he was excited by staring at a piece of apple. So I think these curiosities are really the driving force for the advance of art and science in the history. But why this is relevant to design? Maybe you guys wanted to say design is actually practical. When we talk about science and art, not necessarily their function, their goal is to be functional and be helpful and useful for our daily life. But design, as we know, one of the major missions is to be practical. So maybe this is not a right statement. Design should not be curious. Design should be problematic and analytical. But hope through my talk, though, I wanted to share another vision, and I wanted to convince you guys with my vision. So design is actually curious, and curiosity-driven design is a legit method if you want to create novel design applications. So I started my journey of being curious almost 7 or 8 years ago when I was still a PhD student at MIT Media Lab. And then along the way, invited all the other people to join my journey. So this was a new lab I founded 2 years ago at Carnegie Mellon University after I graduated. So now I have all these curious minds that are joining the journey to explore how a human-centered design can be transformed into a curiosity-driven design. And in the lab, we develop materials and thinking about constructing hardware and software tools for these materials, and also thinking how we can leverage them for applications. So this, if you agree, as one of those classic methodologies to think about a design that is human-centered. Indeed, I am situated in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute. Human-centered design is one of the major practices a lot of the professors and students do. And after I joined this HCI Institute at CMU, so I tried to replace basically the center and put curiosity there. And you started to see the change of the surroundings as well. So I wanted to share 4 stories. That is my curiosity and my students' curiosity in error in nature, context, and processes. So let's start with the first story, curiosity in error. For makers who are sitting here, who had experience playing with those low-cost fused deposition printing platform like MakerBot, basically, you know when you 3D print those artifacts, they are very easily to warp. And they are not going to be kept flat. That's why, there are more expensive printers, try to put things into an oven and try to keep the temperature consistent. But we were thinking, we observed this phenomenon, and we had 2 questions. One is why? Why things warp for those cheaper 3D printer? And second question is, can we try to take this disadvantage and can we try to make this disadvantage into an advantages? So this is what we figured. By the way, I am not a polymer chemist. I had to go into it by reading high school textbooks again, but that was because I'm curious. So here is what is actually happening. So when you, for polymer, basically the polymer chains like to stay in this chaotic state, basically like random spaghetti. So when you try to 3D print those thermoplastic polymer on a printing platform, basically you are forcing the polymer chain to go straight. You are melting it down, and you are speeding up as you are extruding it, right? But the preferred state is this chaotic state. So it has a tendency to go back to be more chaotic once it's printed. When you heat it up, this is what happens. Basically, the polymer chain tries to contract, and you will see a bending effect, and that is undesired. It's the warpage defects of your cheap 3D printer. But then we went ahead and tried to engineer this warpage, and actually we tried to create even larger warpage. This was started when I was an artist in residency in Pier 9 at Autodesk. So we can control how much it warps, or in another word, how much it will bend with our material configuration as well. Now you can print things flat, super fast, and very reliably, and then trigger it to self-fold back into a 3D shape. So for example, this rose flower was printed as a flat disk, and it consequently turned into this self-assembled rose when you put it in hot water. And this is the process. So this was when this flat disk is printed, and this ring, when you dip it in hot water, as I mentioned, it will self-assemble into a 3D rose. And we were able to computationally simulate how the folding will happen, or what shape it will fold into as well. For people who had little bit of experience with 3D printing, in order to print this rose in a 1-to-1 scale, you may need to take about 8 hours, because there are a lot of supporting material consumptions. Actually, it ends up really material consuming, and also the removing of the support is going to be a big headache. But with our method, you can take only 1 hour and without any post-processing effort to get this rose. And you can do more things in addition to rose. You can self-fold a boat, a chair, and even an arbitrary shape like a bunny. And among all those, my favorite is this chair. So for example, you can make any flat disc self-assemble into a shape that's actually functional. We were envisioning this could be used for IKEA furniture. So IKEA make all their furniture flat because they save a lot of their logistic cost. But once it's at your home, you have to manually assemble it. And slightly more complicated, more expensive IKEA furniture actually take forever to assemble. What if you can flatly ship a furniture back home, and then by just apply some hot air with your hair dryer to get shape assembled? Or if you want, you just put it in your bath. So that one was a very, very small model we did, and this is actually a 1-to-1 scale chair surfaces we were able to morph from a flat shape. Remember, you guys, my lab is called Morphing Matter Lab, so I will keep using these words morph in addition to curiosity. So on the left hand, it is the it's the 2D shape. So the color actually represents how much each beam within this grid would shrink. So when you dip this in water, it will contract and buckle up into 3D and eventually form the chair surfaces on the right hand. And we are envisioning basically a sustainable manufacturing pipeline that's empowered by a term called 4D printing. But the idea is that when you are printing it, you are saving printing time and material, and then you save shipping costs. And once it's on site, it can self-assemble to save your self-assembly effort. And eventually this shape that's 3D can be flattened into 2D when you need to, for example, move to a new house. You can flatten your chair again. It's reusable in that sense. And if you decided you completely don't like it anymore, you can recycle the material completely, because PLA, which is the material we use for this project, is made of cornstarch. That's like a known fact, right, for a lot of MakerBot hobbyists. So I continue with my second story, so how the curiosity in nature can also lead us to interesting inventions or interesting design. So I grew up in Inner Mongolia, so this is some of the common pine trees I would see when I was a child. I used to go out to pick up mushrooms after rain, and another thing that I would pick up along the way is the pine cone. So maybe you noticed it before. So after the rain, the scales of the pine cones are often closed. And when you put it on the balcony for a couple of days, all the scales will open up. As a kid, I used to play this game, so I'll put it back in water again. And after a couple of hours, you will see it get closed again. If you think about it, this is a super intelligent, smart material. The transformation is empowered by water intake. There's no electricity, but this material is responsive smartly to the environmental conditions. And it is a reversible process. Yes, we are talking about a nature-engineered smart material here. And this is basically a speed-up version of how the pine cone can open and close. After I joined my graduate school, I got my memory back of how I play with pine cones because I started to study smart materials. I started to read science papers and realized pine cone worth a science publication. And there are many, many plants, and each of them almost is another science paper. And they had all very different and interesting transformation behaviors. And they are all electricity-free and powered by nature. So this case, for example, is a seed pod. The leaves will form this basically helical structure to shoot out the seeds once the seeds are once the beans are matured. So this is another really magical plant. Actually, my labbers are studying this very intensively. So it's a seed in the desert. When the rain comes, so the seed will basically form a coiling motion and drill itself into the ground. So the seed is so smart that it can recognize when is the best timing for itself to be seeded. And it is purely based on a transformation mechanism of a coil. And this is another flytrap plant. Basically, it causes a very rapid buckling behavior to capture flies. It eats meat, basically. And in Morphing Matter Lab, we study all these kind of morphing mechanism from nature. If you ask me why, what problem we are trying to solve, we are not trying to solve any problems. We're just, curious. And we wanted to study the science of it and how nature is constructing them. And the smallest unit of a morphing matter so far that's responsive to moisture or water in general is this bacteria. We have been studying this since the days when I was a PhD student at MIT. So this was a special bacteria called Bacillus subtilis natto bacteria. The reason we chose natto because it was after it was discovered in Japan, it was considered a food. So it's completely safe for designers. It's easy to play with and easy to imagine where this can be used. And it has a very interesting story. So Japanese actually found this when they were when a samurai was on their trip to a battle. So they figured the soybean carried by this dry rice stalk made bag tasted much better. Later on, they figured it was the bacteria inside the dry rice stalk fermented the soybean. And since then, this has been a breakfast in Japan. So if you go to Tokyo, you ask for natto, this is what you get. And we actually ended up putting this soybean under a microscope. You will see actually billions of bacteria covering the soybean. And this is the natto bacteria we're studying. Although we are using this novel function out of this Asian bacteria, is its actuation function. And if you place this bacteria on a thin film and try to trigger it by breathing on it, you actually will see the bacteria swell, and that will pull the substrate up to form a bending motion. So if you try to deposit this bacteria in an order, you can get different origami structure that can be responsive to moisture environment. So here we were steaming on top of these films we printed. And it's super sensitive to the skin. So this was happened by accident. Remember my theme today, it's invention driven by curiosity. So we didn't know this thing can be used for wearables. We ended up making a wearables because it's super sensitive to the skin. And we consulted New Balance folks, and then they gave us this heat map, told us where is the most sweatier part on your body. And we ended up following their heat map and developed this garment. And you have all the flaps on the back of the garment. And when the body is cool, basically all the flaps will be closed. And when your body gets sweatier, so the flaps will open up. This sounds familiar because it's basically how the pine cone works. And it's powered, in this case, the transformation is powered by your sweat. So another interesting part of this is it was a curiosity of our team as creators who initiated this project, but it ended up that the curiosity spread it to every single person we worked with through this project. So these two dancers, they are professional dancers from Boston Ballet Company. We asked them to model for our garment, but they ended up getting really curious how these bacteria work, and they wanted to feel they wanted to basically imagine what would happen if they tried to dance with other living beings on their body. So they actually ended up inventing some interesting dance moves because they were thinking they are dancing with other things on their back. So we were inspired and started to talk about a art exhibition called Dancing with Billions of Bacteria. Eventually ended up some live shows both at MIT and also somewhere else. I remember there was once maybe in Wired, UK, in London. yeah, this is the video to document the whole process. So our curiosity actually drove us further than this design project. So we were thinking, because we're using a bacteria, which is called Bacillus subtilis, it turns out to be a model bacteria for genetic engineering labs. And you can easily modify its DNA to embed other functionalities. I know in Bay Area nowadays, synthetic biology is a really hot topic. And you guys all know, perhaps, making a little bacteria glow is the easiest trick you can do with synthetic biology. So that's what we did. So we ended up making the bacteria can also glow. And this glowing can get more and more intense as you get sweatier as well. So you can start to envision a piece of fabric that can glow more and more intensively, as well as open up when you are getting sweatier, running in dark. And we showed this piece as a garment sculpture in between kind of thing in Centre Pompidou in Paris. So this is pretty interesting because we got it published in Science Advances, and scientists liked it, but in the same time, artists also like it. Go back to my whole statement of curiosity-driven design. Maybe some of you guys don't agree with me and have indeed deeper understanding or vision of what today's problem-driven design is. To my shallow understanding, I think problem-driven design is pretty much problem-focused. Apparently, your design is towards a specific function. But in terms of curiosity-driven design, in my head, I think the design can start from somewhere and end it in a random place or in many possible places. So you think about this biologic bacteria project. Yes, we made a functional garment. We actually ended up doing some dream tests for the sake of writing the paper and talking to our sponsors. But we also ended up kind of encouraging the curiosity from the artists, the dancers who we are working with. And for me, it's getting personal when we started to produce the video. I actually see it also as a video production project. It's my first time being a director, thinking through the storyline and trying to be really not compromising the visual effect, although it is a research project from a graduate school. And also there are, interesting social and cultural discussions that are coming from this project. And these are all not quite functional in a conventional sense when we think about a problem-driven design. I didn't do any user studies, neither my collaborators, for example. And we were basically based on our intuition trying to think what is the best and what is the most interesting way to inspire both the science and also the art community. So to move on, I also wanted to share the story of how we get really curious in the process of making something. Even people in the audience, even you are not a physical designer, let's say, or hardware designer, I'm pretty sure you agree with me. There is a joy. There is a joy in the process of making. It's independent from whether it's tangible media, tangible tools you are using, or it's digital media and digital materials you are playing with. It is the process that really inspire us to come up with interesting ideas or inventions. So after I joined Carnegie Mellon, I noticed in our neighbor lab they have a lot of fancy knitting machines, industrial knitting machines. And the professor who ran the lab, Jim McCann, tried to convince me that 3D knitting machine is really winning the game of 3D printing, comparing with 3D printers. For a person who has been working on printing forever, I'm like, yeah, I have to try this. He must be right because he made a bunny that's 3D within 10 minutes. How cool is that? So I got to study a little bit more, and this is one of the videos he shared with me. So it is how 3D knitting machine work. Don't get confused with weaving. I know Google does a lot of weaving fabric. This one is how your sweater usually is fabricated. So you have many needles. Basically, the needles will pull a single thread and form all those loops. And loops after loops, rows after rows. That's how your sweater is made. Two important factors to play with, materials to play with. One is the bed that embed all the needles, and the other one is a yarn carrier that carries this single thread that you can make loops with. And it turns out there are multiple beds you can play with, and there are more than a single yarn carrier. So basically, that's how you can mix different colors in your sweater. So we, of course, from Morphing Matter Lab, we want to make everything morph. Looking at Jim McCann's little bunny, I'm like, can we try to morph the bunny? So I ended up working with my PhD student, Leah, and also colleague Professor Scott Hudson, to think about how you can embed tendon into one 3D knitting toolpath. So what is tendon? So this is tendon-driven knitted artifacts. Basically, a thread that can be pulled, and as you pull it, you can trigger whatever that you knitted. You can imagine Nike will be interested in this kind of project because they can knit the shoe, but with the shoelace already knitted into it, right? With one machine knitting toolpath, because that will save a lot of time for the fabrication. So there are two essential roles. One is to knit horizontal tendon. This turns out there are some tricks you can play with this V-bed knitting, basically two needle beds to interlace a horizontal tendon. And there are also tricks you can use to embed vertical tendon by adding another yarn carrier that carry this blue tendon thread. And with the horizontal and vertical tendon, you can start to embed diagonal tendons into the structure. So until this point, by the way, we didn't know what are the killer apps for it. We're barely problem-driven anyway. So I encouraged Leah to move ahead and trying to think what fun demos we can do. First of all, she showed more technical demos. She's like, oh yeah, now you can embed tendon in arbitrary directions. You can make very robust robotic tentacles. These were the things soft robotics really like to use to demo how robust their actuation or how flexible their actuation techniques are. And we ended up also knitting a little bunny, a tribute to Jim McCann, the professor. And so for the bunny, there are embedded tendons that are white. So in this case, we actually can trigger the bunny to move its ear and also hug you. So there is a little capacitive sensing, yeah, Leah's favorite. So there's a capacitive sensing patch at the heart. So we are also knitting sensors into the structure as well. But sensors for morphing labbers are low-hanging fruit. Actuations are much more intellectually challenging, and that's what we like to focus on. But anyway, so I started to, until this point, we were still curiosity-driven, but I started to try to tell a better story to raise funding to support the work. I'm like, imagine you embed Alexa into this soft robot. Now everybody's talking about personal soft robots, personalized robots at home, but it still all look like hard gadgets, right? What about if you have a fluffy toy that can also respond to you, tell you the weather, hug you when your baby are crying or when your grandma are feeling lonely. So there are a lot of interesting things about 3D knitted soft robots, because not only they are soft robots, but also they are textiles, right? They are soft goods, and there are emotional attachment and affective interactions you can build on top of those. And if you started to combine more conventional 3D knitting techniques like shaping and texturing together with our tendon technique, you can think about more interesting products. For example, this pleated lampshade that can be triggered to open and close on the fly, or a sweater that has a smart shoulder to pet you. We talk about maybe this can be petted by your mom from Inner Mongolia while you are not sleeping after midnight in San Francisco, trying to play video games, or maybe just a warning system to tell me, hey, you are like over speaking tonight, please stop right now. So there are many ways you can start to embed digital informations into those smart goods once they are textiles, and that's why I am interested in encouraging this type of work from a morphing matter perspective. So we not only play with 3D knitting machines, basically we get really curious whenever we see fancy, especially expensive machines. And this was another one. It's a $500,000 laser cutter, but a laser cut in super high precision. It's a printer from Professor Kamal Majidi's lab. So we ended up cutting all those zigzag conductive traces out of copper. Once you make those conductive traces out of copper, which is super conductive, you can embed all kinds of sensors and semiconductor-based electronics into your system. So we are showing stretchable fabric as a technical demonstration. So we ended up making a super. So by the way, the super lady Catherine, she is actually a material science senior student who is a morpher in the lab. She's just modeling it on the side. But we ended up making all the patches for different functionalities, so you can sense temperature, motion, basically whatever you want, and viral data, viral health sensor, 1-pixel camera. So we customized the function for different parts of the body. This is one of my favorite. So as you are eating, depending on if you're eating potato chips or apple, do a little bit of simple machine learning tricks, you can monitor that. It's a simple microphone, but it detects the food type. You can imagine this will allow you or alarm you to eat more apples than chips. So my last story about how curiosity will make your life and job more fun and more inventive. That is the curiosity in kitchen. And you can maybe also call it curiosity in materials. And I have been really interested in studying materials, especially smart and responsive materials in kitchen. This was one of those documentaries, viral documentaries in China. So I saw there are a lot of material that are morphable. For example, you can stretch the noodle as long as you want, and when you try to fry a bread in hot oil, you can get a big balloon. So that is to do with the thermal expansion law, right? And when my grandma also tells me if you try to cook dumplings, you will see when it's floating on top of water, that means it's done. So there are also interesting buoyancies. So there are always, science combined with our daily life. So we started to list all the possible physical phenomena. I actually talked to a physicists trying to figure this out, because I love working with physicists because they also do useless things driven by curiosity, but they always ended up with immensely useful conclusions. So we decided to choose swelling rate to start with our journey inside the kitchen. So everybody knows swelling. This is starch, one of the main ingredients in your pasta. So when you cook a piece of pasta, the starch will attract all the water molecules and cause the swelling behavior. That means your pasta becomes softer and bigger. Super simple. But it turns out if you try to decompose all the edible ingredients, you will find different swelling ratio, and rate for different raw ingredients. For example, cellulose or fiber components inside the food will have a completely different swelling ratio comparing with starch. So this is actually a simple piece of Jell-O. I'm talking about the Jell-O you can actually buy from CVS or Target. So it's a single piece of Jell-O, but in the center part, we covered the Jell-O with a bit of cellulose. And then you can see the growing rate, this is the swelling rate of the center part is slower than the edges where there are no cellulose cover. So I play this video again. Basically, the center part grows slower because it's composed of both cellulose, that's less swellable, and gelatin, but the edges are only gelatin. And that's cool. So I play the old trick. If I try to 3D print the cellulose selectively to some regions on a super swellable gelatin film, maybe you can start to play with the swelling ratio of this film. And that way you can make a flat film turn into a banded shape when you cook it. So you can also make a flat disk that turns into a potato chip shape when you are cooking it. And you can be a bit fancier if you combine with some computational simulation method. You can make a disk that turns into a flower, and then the flower will go kind of dead by the end as you cook it. And this is some of the outcome. So all the shapes you are currently seeing, they are after being cooked. When they were made, they were all flat. So it's a self-folding projects or self-fooding materials, if you will. And until this point, again, it was driven by curiosity, but then again, I had to get some funding to support my students. So I tried to tell a practical story, behaving like I'm an engineer and a practical designer. So I told the food industry, hey, if you make all your pasta flat, you can save a lot of shipping and packaging costs. For example, macaroni compared to flat spaghetti pasta will actually spend sorry, the other way to say it. So flat pasta can save, comparing with macaroni, can save almost more than 60% of the packaging space, because for 3D shapes, you pack a lot of air. But Italians like pastas in 3D shapes because they have different textures. They are paired with different sauces, right? So there may be a market there. And we also told the story to the media after we published the work, back still when I was at MIT. And it went viral everywhere, and people were thinking this pasta is really becoming true. And we started to receive email asking, oh, actually the American Kitchen asked us to do a live demonstration, tell Americans how to make shape-changing pasta live on TV. So of course we said no, because all these shapes were made of gelatin. They never tasted like pasta. And there's a very small market for gelatin self-folding pasta. But I ended up giving a talk in Milan, and this was maybe right before I joined Carnegie Mellon. So I was happily going there because I'm like, finally I got a chance to talk about this vision of self-folding pasta to Italian, see how much they can accept it. But yeah, it ended up really a great event, and the mayors of, I forgot, maybe the culture mayor in Milan actually was there, and all the audiences really liked the idea. So they even got me in touch with a Italian pasta company. And we ended up actually getting semolina flour grown from Italy into our lab and trying to experiment with them. So the whole vision is that we wanted to actually make it happen because it seems like the world really like it and maybe need it. And this is the real pasta. And worth to say, they don't have any additive ingredients. Whenever I say engineer food, they were like, people don't like GMOs and synthetic chemicals, but here there are just the semolina flours. And you can see the top is before it's boiled, and the bottom is after it's boiled. And these are collections of pasta we offered to the Italian pasta company we are currently working with. And again, so on the black background, they were before it's being boiled. And now it takes legitimately 10 to 15 minutes for it to morph, because they are just normal flour. It takes basically exactly the same process to cook them. And these are my students carrying some pasta for a hiking trip. Telling the joke that maybe not a joke is coming true. The pasta company is actually trying to license the technology from CMU. So next time you try to propose in a fancy Italian restaurant, you can customize your food to carry information. Carrying information, that sounds very Google. And IoT, right? Internet of Things through your food. How fancy is that? So we also ended up working with a high-end French cuisine restaurant, try to see how these kind of experiential food or smart materials can enrich our fine dining experiences. download time. The caviar, the film is wrapping. So I want to explain the very last one a little bit. So it's a long piece of noodle. You put it in water. If you cook it for a bit longer time, it started to chop itself into smaller pieces. You can imagine you can cook within one pot for both yourself, who like longer noodles for its texture, and your kids who like shorter ones for easier digestion. So in a sense, you are programming the cookability and the texture and the shape through the pre-programmed logic into your food. I'm almost done with my journey. Summarize with a little bit of immature theories here. Just capture my own thoughts. So again, talking back about the problem-driven design. So yeah, I know you guys also talk about this divergence for the needs, converge for specific use cases, and diverge for your design process, and converge for the final solution. But however this goes, you start from a specific design goal almost. You kind of ended up solving that specific problem you are targeting. But going back to this curiosity-driven design, we're kind of random. So you start with some sort of a goal. You really make yourself or your students slightly oriented. But then you started be more like a person who are driving a boat but without a compass. You are doing the detours, or you are stopping along the way, and you're seeing beautiful sceneries and get distracted, and you completely get distracted. You may not get back to the original goal you set, but along the way, you discovered all those beautiful, beautiful things, and you may find the continent of America eventually. But the whole point is that, think about this food project. We are trying random things. Pasta was sort of a goal at the beginning, self-fooding pasta, but real goal, actually, honestly, it was self-fooding dumplings I wanted to make for my mom in China. Because every time I went back, she spent a lot of time cooking. But dumplings are really hard to self-morph. Cannolis are much easier. But we also ended up exploring those self-chopping food and fine dining experiences. And nowadays, we're even doing self-fooding cookies. All these knowledges, they are shared. They can be shared. They are shareable. And that's all because we're curious. That's all because we're kind of doing these things random. We are making friends with the materials in the lab. We're being patient. We're being focused. And we are also trying to combine our scientific ways of doing experiments and culturing insights with our ways of thinking through the design practices. So why designers? Why designers are important for these kind of examples I showed you? You can argue you can be a material scientist in order to engineer a piece of pasta to self-fold. As a designer, I'm not sure if I still would call myself a pure designer. I do have a design undergrad degree. So I think there are a lot of things I contributed along the way for the examples I showed you. So yes, we started with often phenomena. We put them into fancy machines and different, mechanical, chemical testing facilities to understand the capabilities of the technology. I call it possibility of technology. But once all these possibilities are there, what's the next step? That's actually when designers can play a really important role, because we can think about the purpose of the design. We can leverage our intuition and sensation through the practices of design thinking to better leverage this possibility. Eventually, what technology will be used are actually decided by the designers in the team. This has been my honest journey. So So take this as an example, the self-chopping noodles I just said. The fact was, I was working together with a chemical engineer who is a postdoc at MIT Chemical Engineering Department in the lab. And we were trying to fine engineer the self-morphing effect with 1 degree, resolution accuracy. But then we figured some of the pasta dissolve faster than the other one. It turns out we are just buying from the same chemical company 2 gelatin, but have different molecular weight. Molecular weight basically represents how long the polymer chain is, if you remember high school chemistry. And she was frustrated. She was like, oh, this is not controllable. We bought the wrong material this time. And I was like, this is cool. You can cook and control the dissolving time. If you try to compose those 2 materials with the same, within the same noodle, you can then make a timer, basically programmable noodle that can self-chop itself. So I think it is, to some extent, her solid scientific knowledge and my intuition as a designer gave birth to this self-chopping noodles. And of course, along the way, I tried very hard to equip myself with more rigorous engineering knowledges, because I do believe, as I shared, if you know more about the scientific theory and also the processes of how machines work, how materials work, you will be able to infuse more of your design thinking and sensations to the early stage of your project development. And I believe that's true beyond this kind of fictional morphing matter research that we are doing. And passionately curious is not something new. Einstein told us. Curiosity is really important, and also being passionately curious extremely important. So in my lab, I keep telling my students, no matter what kind of technical background or design background they come from, they should try to combine their rigorous thinking with imagination and fantasies with reality. So ultimately, if they can be passionately curious with the kind of the humble subjects they are dealing with, like thermoplastic, or expensive and fancy subjects like the bacteria we're playing with, they can all result in exciting outcomes. And I'd like to thank all the curious minds behind the projects I just listed and talked about, and all the funding supports along the way. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you guys want to get in touch, emails is shared here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your amazing talk. It was absolutely mind-blowing. I just had one quick question on the bacteria. I noticed there's almost like a symbiotic relationship between the human being and the bacteria. I was wondering, have you, I work with a lot of people who work with CRISPR. Have you thought about using CRISPR to genetically reprogram the bacteria to actually give it more of what it's doing, or new features?
Yeah, so we didn't use CRISPR. There were some DNA engineering we did to make the bacteria glow, responding to sweat. But if you check the paper that was published in Science Advances, it's actually called multifunctional genetically modified nanoactuator. So the whole vision behind was there are many synthetic materials you can use to make this piece of fabric responding to your sweat. One selling point of using bacteria is that you can genetically modify it to make it multifunctional. For example, you might be able to engineer a piece of fabric that will generate some perfume along the way when you get sweatier. And we even talk about if you need some of those active functionality into it, you might need to actively feed the bacteria. You can have a piece of garment every night. Instead of putting it in a normal closet, you put it in a nutritious closet that has flowing nutritions every night, so you can keep culturing your bacteria. We didn't go that far. We did got attracted some interest from, indeed, some venture capital firms in San Francisco area. I do believe there are some things that can be done. And you can do a lot of health-related sensing with it, too. I know there are already commercially available products that basically use biology approach to extract the chemicals from your sweat and indicate that with color. We can definitely indicate that with the shape as well, if you will.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm very inspired. I am curious about what other areas of is your lab being curious about? What are you guys working on next?
Like I mentioned, so we are actually there are many different levels. Just in terms of technical development, one of the missions being a research lab in a university is that we wanted to keep pushing the limitation of technology, or in other way to say, creating platform technology that can benefit the majority, not just the single lab. So we are aggressively trying to develop a more easy-to-use computational tool to allow the morphing matter to be fabricated. One challenge is those morphing matter, they are highly nonlinear soft materials for most of the case, very slow to simulate if you want to capture the precise morphing behavior. So we are trying to integrate machine learning and the numeric simulation method to make computational tools easier. And a slightly more fun side, so we started to investigate more natural morphing organisms nowadays. The desert plants that can drill itself into the ground is this one thing we're exploring with the hope that maybe one day after California fire, you can just deploy some artificial seeds with a drone and it can quickly replanetary the mountain. Not sure even if it's practical, but I'm just curious. And what else? Yeah, so that's on the kind of application side. So we are also trying to, nowadays, this is not just because we are curious. This is actually because we wanted to benefit the humanities. We are trying to see, now we are having more and more knowledge in terms of how to tame and manipulate things to morph and sense and morph. In a sense, we are trying to actually put this into more practical and relevant application area. For example, for health, can you make smart drugs or smart surgical tool that you can swallow inside your body and do certain things? Rather than just making pasta, can you actually make it beneficial for your health, for drug deliveries and minimum invasive surgeries? But these are really long-term scientific inquiries. I don't see you can buy a piece of pasta. Maybe I can see that in a few years, but surgical tools that can self-deploy into a tweezer and then you can get out once it's done its surgery. Maybe 10 years. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. This has been super inspiring and mind-blowing, as someone in the back said. Join us next month. We will be talking about design is play with our next speaker. So everyone have a great evening.